Well, Katerina, it's wonderful to have a chance to speak with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time. And of course, um, choral enthusiasts will be familiar with your work, of course. And Camerata is so looking forward to performing Come Back Like the Sea with Singing this fall. It'll be the opening number on my first concert with Camerata, and I'm really stoked to get to introduce this piece to the choir and to the audiences. I wonder if you could just begin by telling us a little bit about yourself, your musical background, and maybe some of what draws you to writing for choirs in particular.
So I was born and raised in Burlington, Ontario, on the other side of the country. And I grew up singing in a wonderful children's choir called the Hamilton Children's Choir, conducted by Zemfira Polos, who a number of people might know. She's quite active in the Canadian choral community now, directs the Toronto Children's Chorus now. And
Luminary,
that was
really.
really, yeah, she's absolutely fantastic. And I was very lucky that timing wise, when I started singing choral music, was the year that she moved to Canada and started teaching. And I had been singing for a number of years before then. I had been studying music, but when I joined that choir and started singing choral music, that was the first time that everything clicked for me. And I found my musical home, I found my community. And I like to joke with people that my way of never leaving choir was becoming a composer for choral music, because I just loved it so much that I needed to find a way to stay.
That's wonderful. And so now, where do you live? And tell us a little bit about maybe some of the projects that you have on the go.
Yeah. So right now I'm based on the other side of the country. I moved out to Vancouver for my master's degree in composition about 8 years ago now. It's wild how quickly time flies. And I made the Lower Mainland my home. I'm living just outside of Vancouver. And I'm working on all sorts of stuff. My, home will always be choral music and the majority of music that I write, but I'm also working on some orchestral music. I'm writing a piece for the Toronto Symphony Orchestra next up on the docket. I also have a mixed media collective that explores music with use of technology. So that's sort of a whole other avenue, but I do a lot of work in that realm as well. I'm also working on I guess my first big opera. That one's been happening for a while. It's the biggest one, but I've written another opera since then, funny enough. So I've done a whole bunch of different things, but those are sort of the fun things that I'm working on now.
That's wonderful. Well, we will absolutely keep sort of up to date about those projects. That's really exciting. Let's sort of maybe hone in on this work in particular. Come back like the sea was singing. Let's begin with the text, as it's probably a good idea to do. What drew you to this particular text from Sara Teasdale, and maybe can you tell us a little bit about what it means to you?
So this is, I feel like I'm pretty sure the first time I read it, I cried. Reading through this text because of the moments in time. It was, I think, 2019 that I came across it. Will D'Souza, who conducts Coastal Sound, who was the commissioning and premiering choir for this, sort of narrowed down a number of poems, and we were looking through them together, all sort of ocean and water themed. This was one of them. Piece got delayed, of course, because of the pandemic, and the idea was that this piece was going to be the first concert, and it was post-pandemic with everyone singing together. And there's a line at the very end of this poem, come back like the sea with singing and the light of a million stars. And I just started tearing up. I mean, this was at a time when we didn't know when or if we were going to start singing again. And it felt like the poem and that line in particular were written for now. So that gives you a little bit of an insight into what I thought the poem was about, but I'll also just articulate it in a nicer package as well. But for me, the piece or the poem at its heart is really about impermanence. Whatever emotion or thing we're struggling with, whether we're having a difficult day or a difficult year or years, in terms of the pandemic and whatnot, life is cyclical and we can learn so much from nature. And in this case, Sara Teasdale relays that feeling and that emotion in these times in our lives to the rise and fall of the tide, the ebb tide, and how, she's looking ahead essentially to this time and longing for that return. Although it's difficult when you're in it, she knows that it's going to return to better days. And so I almost imagine, I'm a very visual thinker when I compose and when I read things like this. that she's, standing maybe with her feet in the sand and feeling the tide coming up on her, and it's as the sun is rising, and it's a new day at the very end of the piece. I imagine it's sort of like she's made it at the very end. So the poem doesn't quite get there, but that's the way I've set the music. So
Mm. And I love that you talk about that element, because I really think that, it's wonderful when you are studying a score and you do get kind of like inspired by the visual elements of the score
mhm.
itself. So there's even elements in the piano part and just the way that you
Yeah.
sort of parts where I feel like this opening up happens, and where sometimes the rhythms, the twos against threes and things just
Yeah.
sort of help to create, and even the visual element, they really do kind of seem to take on sort of symbolically this particular kind of flavor. And that's the kind of thing that the performers kind of only get sort of the inside scoop on that. The audience members aren't watching the score as it's going by, but most times. But the idea there of the visual that really is sort of is drawn for you from the poem is really beautiful one. I have to just say, sort of self-indulgently, that this is a piece that I was able to hear the premiere performance of with Coastal Sound Youth Choir. I had worked with Coastal Sound for a few years, and Will's a dear friend of mine, and I got to see the first performance of this work, and I thought, I can't wait to conduct this myself. And then was able to perform it, and it was the last piece that I performed with the Valley Festival Singers in Abbotsford, BC, before I left at the end of last season, and it will be the first piece that I get to conduct with the Halifax Camerata Singers in Halifax. So very self-indulgently, but this particular work of Katerina Gimon will be one that is very close to my heart. So I wonder, what would you say are some of your musical influence? You've talked about kind of your feeling at home with choirs, but maybe even ones that are not, and multimedia sort of work as well. I'm working in opera, I'm working with orchestra. But what are some ways that you maybe feel you've been really influenced? Maybe they're not evident in this particular work, but just to give us some insight.
Of course. So a couple big ones that I always like to mention. One of the first composers and selection of pieces that I really fell in love with and connected with growing up in children's choir was works by Armory Schaefer, Canadian composer
Mm.
Armory Schaefer. I remember singing Gamelan. I think we sang Moonlight for Epitaph, a whole series of Schaefer works, and I had never seen music that looked like that. That gave the performer the freedom to inject little moments of themselves. And I think that was sort of where my first hint of composer, more in the classical world sense, started coming out in those moments. Um, and I was, on the edge of my seat, the eagerest person whenever we were singing those pieces. So that's one big one in terms of the choral world. On the other hand, before I even started composing, I was very much in the world of singer-songwriter, and I grew up during a fantastic era of really incredible, powerful women singing. So when I was really little, Spice Girls were really killing it. And then as I got older, Alanis Morissette, Avril Lavigne. I also really loved Cranberries. So this sort of like folk rock, experimental, strong women doing things, I was always so into. And so I was always trying to learn those songs myself, create my own versions of that. So I was very influenced by that as well. My heritage as well was very influential. My grandparents all came from Ukraine, sort of in the years after World War II. And as many people know, Ukrainians are very, very proud of their culture. So I grew up doing Ukrainian dance and Ukrainian school and singing and whatnot. So also got exposed to a lot of the folk music through that. So those are sort of the three main influences that I'll highlight.
Oh, that's wonderful. And certainly in some of your other works that I know, there's sort of graphical notation in certainly the elements. There are some of those
Mhm.
components in to the mountain peak. Am I saying that correctly?
Yep, to the peak of the mountain.
The peak of the mountain, sorry. I know that there's some of those elements, and you sort of seem to kind of just sort of do a slight nod to that in this work, in that the basses do get a soundscape kind of moment at the beginning.
They
So
do, yeah.
not to give that away, but the idea of, like, it's not, and that's something that I found in this piece in particular, is that I think giving like the great respect that you have for Schaeffer's music, maybe in particular, but lots of other composers who maybe have used graphical notations or sort of non-idiomatic elements in terms of choral components in their writing. It is so effective in this piece because it really seems as though it's this sound that's been going on from before, and it's like for the poet as well. It's like you're right there, and it's like this space that's created, I think, for the poet to kind of just like speak into that. So it's really a beautiful, I think, a really compelling kind of component of the piece. So of your compositional output for choirs, maybe is there a piece that you find is most unlike this one? And then maybe is there one that you think like, yeah, it sort of falls into a similar kind of tone or has a similar kind of resonance?
I think the most different would have to be Fire, which is funny because that's my
Yes,
most popular piece, but it's really its
sure.
own beast. There's never going to be, another one that's exactly like that.
Yeah.
Um, I suspect a lot of people might know that one, but for people who don't, it's just a very, energetic, rhythmic piece of mine. There's no words, very short, very high energy. So that's Fire at its heart.
Yeah.
In terms of similar pieces, I don't think there's anyone that's, super, super similar, but the closest one I would say is I wrote this piece over the pandemic called Take This Thread. That was a collaboration with several choirs from across Canada. It was called the Sing Across Canada Project. Actually, Halifax Camerata, I thought was one of them. I'm pretty sure.
I'll have to check. I think you maybe
Okay, I should remember this. I'm pretty sure.
yeah.
Yeah, and it was also Edmonton, Pro Coro, Grand Philharmonic was the leader, but there were several. Actually, yeah, Jeff Dutry was there because that's why I'm getting confused because different director. So
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
everyone remember this, but I wrote this a couple years ago and then it was premiered virtually.
Yes.
The piece, very different topic, but also sort of this thread of connecting, healing, overcoming grief, and the piano also sort of has this kind of folky vibe, very different than
Mm.
Come Back Like the Sea, but same kind of, I guess, influences I will say you can hear within it. So that would be the closest I could identify.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And not to say that like one is derivative of the other, but just, as I'm getting to
Yeah.
know a composer's work more and more, and especially for someone who's as prolific as you are and who has so much ahead and has just written so much that many choirs and ensembles are singing. If you love this, which you will, then it's always fun to see what else there is, of course.
Yeah.
And I think just so that you're kind of aware and for our audience to hear a little bit as well about kind of the narrative of this program, because you speak about some of the influences of singer-songwriters. So this work will open the program on November 11 and 12. And at the center of this program is David Lang's Little Magical Passion. So that's been paired with a work from Dan Steenberg, who's another West Coast composer, who's written a work called Elegy for a Lost Child. And that talks about the journey of Dan and his wife and their family at the loss of a child, which is paired with the little match girl. Different stories, of course, but yeah, and very heavy, of course. But there are other works as well, which sort of contrast this idea of journey or hardship and kind of hope and sort of moving forward. But the end of the program, we sort of move ahead, and there's other ways that pieces will kind of echo some of the things from earlier on in the program. But we finish with an arrangement by Ben Dunker of the song Lost and Found by Katie Hertzik. And so I don't know if there will be anything that will kind of resonate specifically with your work, but I was hoping there would be something that would sort of tie in. And it has been arranged by Ben to incorporate the same percussion as the Lang. So there are ways in which hopefully kind of like the
Yeah.
tide flowing in and out,
This will
it'll
go
kind of
through. Yeah.
exactly. So that's kind of the hope. But what I love about this text that you've selected and the piece that you've written is that it does sort of address that idea of challenge in the journey, but that at the end it does really feel with that ah chord, especially at the end, that's just sort of like
Oh, yeah.
this opening up and this idea of either like a sunrise or something. Now to get back to the piano part, because you mentioned the piano part in this other piece. Are you a pianist yourself? Can you talk a little bit about kind of do you compose at the piano? And as a pianist myself, I love the way you've written piano part in this particular
Oh,
piece. So, yeah, can you speak to that at all?
Thank you. So funny enough, I actually started with piano before I started singing. I'd been begging for singing lessons for years, and my mom's a clarinetist, and one of her very good friends was a singer, and she said, "You got to wait till your voice changed." So I studied piano first, although I wanted to study voice. So that's the funny story. But I ended up later on continuing with voice much farther, and continuing with choir much further than I ever did with piano. I think I only went up to about grade 6 RCM, and I continued piano on my own, but I stopped piano lessons and I continued with other stuff. So that to say, I play piano, but it's not my main instrument really anymore. In terms of composing, I piano comes later for me. For me, it's really about the text, the melody, the choral part, and I have a vision of what I want to happen in terms of the piano, but I really weave that in after. So, like for this piece, for example, I knew the piano was sort of going to be helping us with this feeling of the rise and fall of the tide. I didn't know exactly which notes and whatnot. I sort of knew in terms of harmony how things were going to be moving, but then after I had the melody set in, and I knew it was going to be, you know, this many bars or whatever, then I actually go in and I sing and I added in the piano afterwards. So I have a sketch of essentially the melody actually on my iPad here. At the time I switched over to using that instead of staff paper, and I just went and I wrote the piano part and then I typed it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really fascinating. And for me, it seems like it does seem like really an organic whole, like those pieces together. But I often find that because I'm a pianist, I am kind of like piano centric sometimes. If there's a piano part, I tend to almost like favor that and assume somehow like that will unlock more about the piece than sometimes it does. But in this case, I was really drawn because I first encountered it not with the score in front of me, but I was, you know, in performance, I was able to hear it first time. And of course, it was one of the first concerts that, you know, I was hearing after,
Ah,
you know,
actual
numerous
singing.
lockdowns and so forth. So of course, I was really like singer focused and I was really text focused. And so I think because of the way that I sort of took that in initially, I didn't kind of make assumptions about the piano part that I sometimes do. And yet I find that that the piano part here is so, yeah, it's so beautifully textured, the way that the choral parts and the piano parts kind of interweave, but also are kind of like in tension with one another. Because often there's this two against three kind of feeling, and it doesn't feel combative, but it does feel like it just is, the piano provides that to sort of like support, but also those challenging moments, I think. And so yeah, and yet you've written in such a way. Sorry, I'll just continue to gush
Yeah.
because there are so many moments where you write in this way where there's layers in the choral part, but we
Yeah.
don't lose kind of that sense of kind of like the grounded line, whatever it is, kind of throughout. And I'm thinking especially like when the tenors have kind of like come back, like they're just these moments. They don't take away from what's going on in the upper voices, and then you realize that it's like hearkening to what's going on in the piano. It's really quite delightful, and sort of that rhythmic drive as well, which I think is really yeah, it's something that is really compelling
Well,
about the
it's
work.
funny
Okay,
that you say that because I think that's part of the reason I like to do the piano after, because
interesting.
then you can weave in a lot of those moments and it's a lot
Yes.
easier than trying to like, what's the expression, fit a square peg into a circle or whatnot.
Round hole,
If you have
exactly.
it, it's
Yeah.
a lot harder to do that. But if I've
Yeah.
left the space, I have a general idea, and then I say, I could have the piano be a voice in so many places in here, then I can write those moments in and figure out how can they work together. Also things like, what do the singers need here, how can I further this journey, how can I help with the shape of the piece, leading to a
Yeah.
next section or a key change or whatnot, and then
Yeah.
you can really put those moments in and focus on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I'll pick your brain about a couple things, and that's sort of the architecture of this piece in particular,
Yeah.
because it does feel like it could go on for longer, but doesn't, and I so appreciate that. Although I want it to keep going, but that's like, that's a brilliant choice for a composer to make. You leave them
Yeah.
wanting more. But also you've talked about kind of the way that this journey is just sort of opening up. So that's really, I think, emblematic. But there are places where the voices really kind of peak, and you've created these amazing sonorities for the upper voices in particular. They're very challenging, but then again, I'm drawn back kind of to the rhythm, because there are these times where you just choose the places to kind of engage at either a cadence or kind of a peak. Talk to me about kind of architecture and how you kind of build. How do you kind of decide how many kind of increases a piece can sustain? Yeah.
So for a piece like this, it's all about the text.
Mm.
It's all about the text. So much of the structure comes from reading through the text. And for me, any piece that involves text, the first thing that I do is I read through the text out loud. If I'm working with a living poet, I love to get a recording of them speaking it out loud. But in this case, Sara Teasdale is alive. So I just read it out loud several times, really got a sense of the ebb and flow. Pun. No pun intended, but we'll have it be a pun now. Of each line, of each stanza, and of the overall piece. And then I do a really detailed job essentially of marking up the poem. And then eventually I talk about this a little bit in several podcasts and other interviews I've done. My process tends to involve like a 1-page graphic score after that. After I mark down the key points, I'll say, here's my turning point, here's where things change, here's those kinds of things, and I mark it up. So I think for this piece, it would sort of be like this, like this, like this, and then after the comeback section, then it's sort of a resolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sort of looks like that to me, but I don't know if I would even say this is less the interest coming down, but more the dynamics coming down at the end there. The interest is still there, but it's like we've turned the page. So that's essentially how I mark it up. I find those key points and I say, here's section 1, here's the tone of it. And I tend to do that a lot in my scores as well for people looking at the scores.
Yeah.
I've gotten in trouble about publishers because they're like, you have so many words by your tempo marking, but but I love to give people a little bit of an insight of the words.
Conductors love that, by the way.
Oh, really?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah, I love having information.
I know, that's what I thought. I'm like, because every conductor I talk to does that graph that I'm talking about, and those, what words are painting the section is the exact work that you then go do. So why do I do it, think it, not tell you, and then expect you to go do it?
Right. No,
so let's help each other out here.
That's hilarious. I mean, there's also this letting go, I'm sure, of so much of those elements because it is up to the interpreters to make some of those choices. But no, I very much appreciate the information that you provide in the score for sure. I love that idea of kind of the way that, and that's exactly what it sounds like to me, the way you've described it, of course. Is that sort of graphing out or kind of mapping out the score in that way like a technique that you studied and learned, or is that something that has come to you in a way that sort of is just like more comfortable in
It was
writing?
a happy accident, to be honest. It was a process that I discovered writing elements, which was the second choral work I wrote. I wrote it in my undergraduate degree. And I was especially struggling because that piece didn't have text. Right. Also, I'd only ever written the songwriter realm before. And so I was trying to figure out how can I plan, where are the turning points going to be? Because when you're working with the text, a lot of that's in there for you. We can see in the text where, they're now feeling this different emotion or whatnot, or they've revealed a hidden fact, and we can make decisions based on that, musically. But when that doesn't exist, you get to decide. So I created this essentially as a way for me to help guide myself when writing that piece. And it's something that I've kept because I find it really helps me think overall about those shapes and get a really clear picture before I even start writing any melody, before I start writing any piano. I actually come to like staff paper or notation very, very late in my process. I think a lot of that influence is because I sort of came from this background, as a songwriter first, where you often don't write things down or write down as much information. And also because I use my instrument, my voice, and the piano in this case as well, so much as part of my process. And having this kind of plan really makes sure that I have a clear idea before I get locked into anything. Because what can happen otherwise is if I just start writing, then it's really, really hard to go back unbiasedly, I will say. I think that's a word.
It is now.
But also to try and reshape things that already exist. It's so hard to let go of it. So if I can have a clear idea beforehand, it'll make sure or help make more likely that I can get those things across. Because if a composer doesn't have a clear picture of what they're trying to convey and the shape they're trying to make, how is anybody else supposed to know? How are the performers supposed to know? And how's the audience supposed to figure that out? Right. So that's sort of how I look at it.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, our time's almost up, but I did want to just sort of end on this, like literally the sort of the ending note of the work as well, but to also sort of bookend it. Can you talk to me a little bit about kind of what led you to the opening and closing gestures in the piece? Because you talk about text and untext, but you've chosen actually to use a non-text sort of this this syllable or this, this vowel sound in the opening and closing. So what sort of drew you to that as sort of bookends for this work?
Yeah, so for this piece and a lot of public domain pieces I set, I joke I like to break them a lot because the poet isn't alive. So I do a lot of fun breaking. I work with a lot of living poets, and I'm gonna mention Lauren Pete again, who's the one who wrote Take This Thread, who's the other piece I mentioned. And she likes to say that every poem that she writes has a spoken life and it has a sung life.
Mm,
If someone else sets it. And when Sara Teasdale was writing this poem, she wasn't thinking about it being sung to music. So it's written in a pace that makes sense to speak. The cadences are written in that kind of way. But our job, or my job as a composer and our job as musicians is to find the place where do we need more time to sit with this idea?
yeah.
Where has something happened before the piece begins? Has something happened after? And you get to make those kind of decisions. And often it can be a vocally section like we have at the beginning and the end, or it can be repeating lines, come back, come back. That is something I stole from the last stanza, but I repeated because it felt like we needed that. So that's sort of decisions we can make, I think, as composers to help us bring out what's already in the poem. So we can feel what's already in there, but give us more space to sit with an idea and for the meaning to really resonate with us. So that ending section and that opening section, that's what that is to me. The piece just doesn't start when the long day comes by. I feel like that would be very abrupt. I think we need a moment of, I described this image a little bit before. We're on that beach, the sun's going down, we're looking at the water beneath our feet. We're just feeling the weight of the day, maybe thinking about all the things that have happened, running through your emotions, and then you take a deep breath and you begin. And that's almost how I imagine it. And so for this particular section, the opening and the ending, I didn't want any text because of that, because it was more, the purpose was more emotional for me, and setting the scene and getting us ready to dive into, the text. So
Cool. Great. Well, thank you so much, Katerina. And I wonder if we want to go check out more of Katerina Gimon's music, we can go to what website?
KaterinaGimon.com. You can also find me on all of the social at Kat Gimon, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all the places.
Well, thank you so much for writing this beautiful music and for the music that is yet to come. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about this piece. And yeah, we're really excited to share it with the East Coast. This will be the East Coast premiere. Is that not? That must
It will
be.
be. Yeah, as far as I
Must
know,
be
nobody
true.
else has done it on the
Yeah,
East Coast. So Atlantic Canada, I will say premiere.
awesome.
So
That's
I'm looking
fantastic.
forward to that. Thanks so much for having me, and I
All
can't wait
right.
to hear it.
Thanks very much, Kat.